Eddie Van Halen's public image was pure sunlight. The grin, the swagger, the sense that every solo was a celebration. But the guitar world he entered was built on hierarchy, insecurity, and a quiet rule that nobody says out loud. When you change the game, you threaten the people who benefited from the old one. This story is framed as 6 guitarists he hated, but what the transcript actually delivers is something more believable and more human, a sequence of emotional collisions. Eddie's tension with these names isn't presented as constant hostility. It's disappointment, coldness, rivalry, and, most of all, an obsession with originality. In other words, not hatred as a lifestyle, but pain points that stayed with him because he cared deeply about music, identity, and respect. The opening establishes Eddie as a musician who was driven to tear things apart, not out of cruelty, but out of restless curiosity. He wasn't satisfied with what already existed. He wanted to rebuild the instrument's possibilities from the inside, rewiring gear, pushing amps, inventing tones, and turning mistakes into signatures. That relentless drive is what produced the sound the world would later worship. It also produced a side effect. The moment he became revolutionary, he stopped being the kid who loved the legends and became the future they had to respond to. The transcript sets up 3 recurring types of conflict. First is the hero who disappoints you, the idol whose approval you crave and never fully receive. Second is the veteran who freezes you out, those backstage moments where Eddie claims he was met with blank stares, no hello, no warmth, the silent message that he didn't belong. Third is the professional who copies you, the line where inspiration becomes replication, and where Eddie draws a sharp boundary between learning a technique and stealing a melody. That boundary is the core of the narrative. Eddie openly admits he learned by copying as a kid. Everyone does. But once he had built a voice that felt unmistakably his, he couldn't tolerate seeing it mirrored without evolution, especially in front of the same audience. To him, originality wasn't optional. It was the entire point of picking up a guitar. So the hate list framing functions as a hook, but the deeper story is about what it costs to be first. Eddie wanted camaraderie, a simple handshake, a moment of mutual respect. Instead, he often got dismissal, distance, or imitation. And each time, it forced him to mature, to stop treating legends as gods, to stop chasing approval from the old guard, and to accept that innovation creates enemies even when you never intended to make any. By the end of the setup, you can already see where the video is headed. These 6 names are less targets and more mirrors, each one reflecting a different anxiety Eddie faced as he became the blueprint for an entire generation of guitarists. Eddie Van Halen's first and deepest emotional clash was not with a rival, but with a hero. The story begins with Eric Clapton, the guitarist who, more than anyone else, shaped Eddie's earliest sense of what the instrument could express. Long before fame, before innovation, before the world knew his name, Eddie was a teenager sitting in a small Pasadena bedroom, endlessly replaying Cream records, trying to decode every bend and pause and crossroads. Clapton wasn't just an influence. In Eddie's own words, he was God. That context matters because what follows is not a feud in the traditional sense. It's heartbreak. Eddie didn't want to defeat Clapton. He wanted to understand him. He wanted to inherit something invisible, the feeling behind the notes, the emotional weight that made blues guitar feel alive. In those early years, Eddie wasn't chasing attention or recognition. He was chasing meaning. Then everything changed. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had done what very few musicians ever do. He didn't refine an existing style. He detonated it. Eruption didn't sound like evolution. It sounded like an alien transmission. Two-handed tapping, violent dive bombs, harmonic squeals, techniques that had either never existed or had never been pushed so far suddenly became the future of rock guitar. Eddie went from student to revolutionary almost overnight. And that is when the wound appeared. When Clapton was later asked about Eddie's playing and allegedly remarked that he was technically impressive but lacking soul, it struck Eddie like a personal rejection. This wasn't a critic talking. This was the man whose playing had lit the fire in him as a child. Eddie later admitted that the comment broke his heart, not because it questioned his skill, but because it questioned his intent. Eddie wasn't trying to strip emotion from the guitar. He believed he was expanding it. What makes this moment powerful is Eddie's restraint. He never publicly attacked Clapton. He never fired back in interviews. Instead, he internalized the disappointment and quietly tried to understand it. The transcript frames this clash as philosophical rather than personal. Clapton came from a blues tradition built on restraint, space, and subtle phrasing. Eddie came from a mindset of freedom, volume, and fearless experimentation. One valued control, the other valued risk. In that sense, they represented two eras colliding. Clapton was the voice of the 1960s, where emotion lived in simplicity. Eddie was the voice of the future, where emotion lived in excess, speed, and raw energy. The tragedy wasn't that one was right and the other wrong. It was that they were speaking different languages. Their eventual meeting in Los Angeles deepened Eddie's disillusionment. Clapton was polite, professional, but distant. They talked about gear and tone, but not about feeling, not about inspiration. Afterwards, Eddie reportedly said, "He's just a man. I think I love the myth more than the person." That moment marked a shift. Eddie stopped seeing legends as untouchable gods and started seeing them as human, brilliant, but limited. Importantly, the admiration never vanished. Even years later, Eddie spoke with reverence about Clapton's tone on Crossroads, calling it untouchable and pure feeling. The pain matured into perspective. Eddie eventually accepted that Clapton might not get what he was doing, just as he might not fully get Clapton. They were, as Eddie put it, from different planets. This segment establishes a crucial theme for everything that follows. Eddie's conflicts are not driven by arrogance. They are driven by sensitivity. He feels rejection deeply, especially when it comes from people he once loved from afar. That sensitivity is inseparable from his creativity. The same openness that allowed him to reinvent the guitar also made him vulnerable to disappointment. And with Clapton, Eddie learned the first hard lesson of innovation. Your heroes may inspire you, but they are not obligated to understand what you become. As Eddie Van Halen moved deeper into the rock world, the emotional wounds shifted from heartbreak to something colder and more confusing: dismissal. This is where the stories involving Ritchie Blackmore and Joe Perry take on their weight. Not as loud feuds, but as quiet moments that stayed with Eddie far longer than any public insult would have. For Eddie, respect wasn't abstract. It wasn't about awards, magazine rankings, or chart positions. It was human. A greeting, a nod, a shared moment backstage between people who spoke the same language through 6 strings and amplifiers. And when that basic courtesy was missing, it cut him more deeply than criticism ever could. Ritchie Blackmore was one of Eddie's earliest guitar heroes. As a teenager, Eddie studied Deep Purple and Rainbow records obsessively, replaying solos until his fingers burned. Blackmore's playing felt alive to him, dramatic, precise, and full of tension. In Eddie's mind, Blackmore wasn't just skilled, he was prophetic. So when Van Halen exploded onto the scene in 1978, and Eddie suddenly found himself sharing the same orbit as the men he idolized, meeting Blackmore felt like destiny. Instead, it felt like rejection. In interviews years later, Eddie described their first encounter as devastating. Blackmore didn't greet him, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him at all, just a stare. No words, no curiosity, nothing. Eddie recalled being crushed by the silence. This wasn't ego talking. Eddie wasn't demanding praise. He was hoping for connection, confirmation that the bridge between generations could exist. That blank stare haunted him. He would later lump Blackmore together with Joe Perry when describing how certain established guitar stars gave me the shaft with their eyes. It's a striking phrase because it captures something subtle and brutal at the same time. Not hostility, not confrontation, just the sense of being erased. From Eddie's perspective, this coldness wasn't accidental. He believed it came from fear. The late 1970s were a moment of violent transition in rock guitar. Eddie's style didn't simply add to the existing vocabulary, it threatened to replace it. Speed, tapping, extreme whammy use, and aggressive tone shaping rewrote the expectations of what a lead guitarist should be. For players whose identities were built on blues swagger and classic phrasing, Eddie represented a future that made their dominance feel fragile. Blackmore's later comment that Eddie played too many notes became symbolic of that divide. On the surface, it sounded like a mild critique. Beneath it, fans heard an old-school value judgment. Technique without restraint lacks taste. Whether intended or not, the remark reinforced the sense that Eddie was being judged by rules he never agreed to play by. Yet what makes this segment compelling is Eddie's reflection over time. Decades later, he softened. He wondered aloud whether he'd been too sensitive, whether Blackmore might have been shy or uncomfortable. Even then, he never stopped acknowledging Blackmore's influence. The admiration remained intact, even if the personal connection never materialized. That contradiction, worship without warmth, became a recurring pattern. Joe Perry's story runs parallel, but adds another layer: generational gatekeeping. When Van Halen toured alongside established acts, Eddie felt the same chill. No greeting, no recognition, just distance. Eddie interpreted it as older stars feeling threatened, unwilling to help anybody, because helping might mean legitimizing the future that was already overtaking them. Again, Eddie didn't lash out. He internalized it. He played harder. He built something new instead of fighting for entry into an old club. The transcript emphasizes that Eddie wasn't wired for grudges. He loved playing too much. Music, to him, was joy before politics. But that didn't mean the experiences didn't shape him. They taught him that innovation often arrives unwelcomed. The irony, of course, is time. Years later, Joe Perry publicly praised Eddie's playing, calling it phenomenal and admitting he was blown away the first time he heard Van Halen's debut. He described studying Eddie's sound, trying to figure out how it worked. The respect Eddie had wanted in the late 1970s came decades later, after the threat had passed and the legacy was secure. That delayed validation underscores the emotional truth of this chapter. Eddie didn't imagine the resistance. It was real, and it was rooted in transition. When a new voice arrives loud enough to redefine the instrument, the old voices don't always respond with curiosity. Sometimes they respond with silence. Taken together, the Blackmore and Perry stories mark Eddie's shift from seeking approval to claiming independence. He stopped expecting warmth from the old guard, not because he stopped caring, but because he realized respect could not be negotiated, it could only be earned over time. And sometimes, it arrives too late to heal the original wound. This realization sets the stage for the next evolution of conflict in Eddie's story. Once he accepted dismissal, the next challenge was far more dangerous: imitation. Because being ignored hurts, but being copied threatens something deeper. It threatens ownership of the very voice you fought to create. As Eddie Van Halen grew into his role as the architect of a new guitar language, the conflicts around him changed in tone and intensity. Rejection and coldness were painful, but they were survivable. What came next struck at the core of his identity, the moment when influence crossed into imitation. This is where the stories involving Tom Scholz and Rick Derringer become central. Not as gossip, but as ethical fault lines in Eddie's understanding of creativity. The incident with Tom Scholz sits at the intersection of admiration, confusion, and anger. Van Halen and Boston were sharing a bill in the late 1970s, both riding the wave of America's new arena rock explosion. Eddie had just finished a solo that left the crowd roaring, his playing raw and impulsive, driven by adrenaline rather than calculation. Then Scholz stepped on stage and, according to Eddie's later recollection, played the same solo. Not a variation, not a nod, the same musical statement. For Eddie, the moment felt surreal. The audience's attention shifted, eyes turning toward him as if asking whether this was collaboration or something else entirely. Eddie admitted he was drunk, emotional, and instantly furious. To outsiders, it might have looked like homage. To Eddie, it felt like something far more invasive, watching his musical fingerprint detach from him and replayed in real time. What made the situation worse, in Eddie's mind, was Scholl's personality. The transcript described Scholl as distant backstage, rarely socializing, appearing, playing, and disappearing again. Eddie thrived on interaction, talking gear, swapping stories, laughing with crew members. Scholl's reserved, almost hermetic presence read not as introversion, but as arrogance. The combination of aloofness and imitation created a narrative Eddie couldn't ignore. Yet the deeper conflict wasn't personal. It was philosophical. Scholl represented precision and control. An MIT-trained engineer, he built his sound methodically, crafting the Rockman system and engineering Boston's polished, layered tone in a basement studio. Eddie, by contrast, believed music lived in imperfection. He rewired guitars by hand, blew up amplifiers, chased accidents, and trusted instinct over formula. Where Scholl's calibrated sound, Eddie unleashed it. To Eddie, seeing someone reproduce his work without that trial-and-error struggle felt like erasure. Originality, in his mind, wasn't just about notes. It was about the journey behind them. The bloodied fingers, the burned-out amps, the failures no one saw. When someone mirrored the result without that path, it felt like watching a stranger wear your face. Eddie hinted at this frustration in interviews without always naming names. He spoke about players who copied his tapping, his runs, his phrasing, and how flattering it could be, until it wasn't. Come up with your own thing, he insisted. That line wasn't a boast. It was a plea for evolution. Inspiration was natural. Stagnation was unforgivable. If the Scholl story represents discomfort, the Rick Derringer incident represents confrontation. Derringer wasn't a distant technician. He was a veteran Eddie respected deeply, someone whose playing Eddie himself had once borrowed from. That history made what followed hurt even more. When Derringer opened for Van Halen and began playing Eddie solos note for note, melody, phrasing, and even closing with "You Really Got Me," Eddie saw a line being crossed. Eddie's response was direct and emotional. He confronted Derringer backstage, not accusing him of using a technique, but of stealing a melody. That distinction mattered. Techniques belong to everyone. Melodies belong to the person who lived them into existence. When Derringer repeated the act the following night, Eddie drew a boundary that shocked many. Derringer was removed from the tour. To Eddie, this wasn't about ego or dominance. It was survival. Van Halen was still defining itself, still fighting to be seen as more than a novelty. Eddie's sound was the band's heartbeat. Allowing it to be copied so blatantly, especially by an established peer, felt like letting someone siphon off the very thing that made the band unique. What complicates the story is Eddie's honesty. Years later, he admitted he had copied Derringer's licks as a kid. That admission strips the story of moral simplicity. Eddie knew what it meant to learn by imitation. But adulthood, professionalism, and public stages changed the rules. What was acceptable in a bedroom became unacceptable under spotlights. Eddie's father had taught him a rule that governed his entire career. If you play someone else's music, make it your own. That principle defined Eddie's anger. Derringer hadn't transformed Eddie's ideas. He had replayed them. And to Eddie, that wasn't respect. It was theft. Yet even in this conflict, Eddie showed restraint. There were no public insults, no smear campaigns. He enforced a boundary and moved on. Over time, the fury faded into perspective. By the 1990s, Eddie could laugh about it, acknowledging how young and protective he'd been. The story became less about Derringer and more about a truth Eddie accepted. Being first means being copied. This phase of Eddie's life marks a turning point. He no longer sought approval from heroes or warmth from peers. He focused on protecting his voice while continuing to evolve it. But even as he learned to live with imitation, one challenge remained unresolved, one that struck deeper than copying ever could. The final conflict wouldn't be about stealing notes. It would be about stealing authorship through comparison. The final and most emotionally complex chapter of Eddie Van Halen's story is not about imitation in the technical sense, but about something far more subtle and damaging: comparison. This is where Randy Rhoads enters the narrative, not as a villain, and not even as a clear adversary, but as a mirror that Eddie could not escape. In the early 1980s, rock guitar found itself with two young prodigies at the center of attention. Eddie Van Halen had already detonated the instrument with his debut, reshaping what was possible almost overnight. Randy Rhoads, emerging through his work with Ozzy Osbourne, represented another kind of brilliance: classically trained, disciplined, precise, and theatrical. The media, fans, and industry did what they always do in moments like this. They turned it into a contest. For Eddie, those comparisons felt suffocating. Unlike the earlier conflicts with older guitarists, this wasn't about being ignored or dismissed. It was about being challenged at the level of legacy. Eddie wasn't just being asked to share space. He was being asked to share authorship of a revolution he believed he had started. Eddie's comments about Randy reflect that tension. He acknowledged Rhodes's talent openly, but his praise was always paired with a reclaiming of territory. When Eddie said that Randy had learned from him and hadn't done anything Eddie hadn't already done, it came across as defensive to some listeners. But within the context of Eddie's journey, it reads as something more fragile: a man trying to protect the origin story of his life's work. This wasn't arrogance in isolation. It was pressure. By the early 1980s, Eddie's techniques, tapping, dive bombs, harmonics, and hyperfluid phrasing, were everywhere. Guitar magazines dissected his hands. Players slowed records down just to study his movements. Suddenly, the sound he'd fought to invent was no longer uniquely his. Randy Rhoads, incredibly talented and undeniably original in his own right, became the most visible embodiment of that echo. The contrast between the two players made the comparisons irresistible. Eddie played by instinct, leaning into chaos, feel, and improvisation. Randy approached the guitar with discipline, structure, and classical influence. One sounded like fire breaking loose. The other sounded like architecture built under pressure. To fans, it was thrilling. To Eddie, it was threatening. Ozzy Osbourne's later remarks suggest the rivalry was mutual, even if it was never openly hostile. According to Ozzy, Randy didn't speak kindly of Eddie either. That detail matters, because it reframes the relationship as a cold standoff rather than a one-sided resentment. Two young geniuses, both trying to define themselves in a scene that insisted on ranking them instead. The anecdote about a photo of Eddie taped to the bottom of Randy's wah pedal, whether literal truth or scene mythology, functions as a powerful symbol. It represents the desire to escape the shadow of comparison. For Randy, Eddie's name followed him everywhere. For Eddie, Randy's rise felt like the world asking whether the revolution still belonged to him. Beneath Eddie's sharp words, the transcript reveals vulnerability. Eddie wasn't afraid of being surpassed musically. He was afraid of being rewritten historically. He had built his reputation from experimentation, failure, and obsession. He had soldered pickups by hand, blown speakers, and chased tones nobody else could hear yet. To see those ideas reflected back at him through another player, even a brilliant one, stirred a complicated mix of pride, fear, and resentment. Tragically, Randy Rhoads' story ended before any resolution was possible. His death in a plane crash in 1982 froze the rivalry in time. There was no chance for shared stages, no late-life interviews where perspective softens pride, no mutual acknowledgement that often comes with age. What remained was an unresolved emotional loop. For Eddie, that unresolved ending likely deepened the complexity. How do you reconcile rivalry with respect when the other voice is gone? You can't. You're left alone with your thoughts, your earlier words, and the knowledge that time will never offer a correction. In later years, Eddie rarely spoke about Randy with the same sharp edge. When he did, the tone was quieter, reflective. The aggression had faded, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Rivalry exists because the other person matters. You don't feel threatened by someone insignificant. In that sense, Randy Rhoads wasn't Eddie's enemy. He was proof that Eddie's ideas had reshaped the world enough to create worthy successors. This realization ties together the entire hate list narrative. Eddie didn't hate these guitarists in the way headlines suggest. He reacted to moments that challenged his sense of identity, as a fan, as a peer, as an innovator, and finally, as an originator whose legacy was being negotiated in real time. What emerges is a portrait of an artist who felt deeply. Eddie's sensitivity was not a flaw. It was the same trait that allowed him to hear sounds others couldn't imagine. He wanted respect, but more than that, he wanted honesty. He wanted originality to mean something. And when it didn't, when it was ignored, dismissed, copied, or blurred through comparison, he pushed back. By the end of this journey, Eddie learns the hardest truth of all. Once you change the world, it no longer belongs only to you. Others will borrow from it, argue with it, and reshape it in their own image. You can't control that. You can only keep moving forward, creating the next sound before anyone else can catch up. That is where Eddie ultimately finds peace. Not in winning rivalries, but in outgrowing them. By the time Eddie Van Halen reached the later stages of his career, the emotional storms that once surrounded him had begun to settle. The conflicts, rivalries, and moments of anger that marked his rise were no longer raw wounds. They had become reference points, lessons absorbed into a broader understanding of what it meant to be an innovator in a world that constantly tries to absorb and reproduce originality. What stands out most in hindsight is how little bitterness Eddie ultimately carried. Considering how deeply he felt rejection, dismissal, and imitation, it would have been easy for him to harden into resentment. He never did. Instead, he redirected his energy back to the one place it had always belonged, the guitar itself. Creating new sounds became his answer to every challenge. When others copied, he moved on. When others judged, he experimented. When comparisons threatened his legacy, he quietly built something else that no one else could claim. Eddie's philosophy matured into something simple and powerful. You could copy the licks, the techniques, even the tones, but you could not copy the spirit. That belief freed him. It allowed him to stop policing the past and focus on the present. By the 1990s, Eddie could laugh at stories that once made him furious. He could acknowledge how young and protective he had been, without disowning the emotions that drove him there. This shift also changed how he spoke about other musicians. In later interviews, Eddie consistently returned to gratitude. He credited the players who inspired him, even those who had disappointed him personally. He spoke warmly about the records that shaped his childhood, the sounds that lit the original spark. The need for validation from those players was gone. Their influence was already written into his DNA, and no offhand comment or cold encounter could erase that. What Eddie came to understand was that innovation is inherently lonely. When you invent something truly new, there is no shared language at first. People either misunderstand it, resist it, or rush to imitate it. Rarely do they immediately welcome it. Eddie's early pain came from expecting warmth where there was uncertainty and recognition where there was fear. Over time, he learned that those reactions said more about the moment than about his worth. The so-called hate list ultimately reveals more about Eddie than about the 6 guitarists attached to it. It shows a man who cared fiercely about authenticity, who believed music was an extension of the self rather than a set of tricks. To Eddie, originality was not a branding tool. It was an ethical stance. You owed it to the instrument and to yourself to say something new. That ethic explains why Eddie never truly became cynical. Even when the industry shifted, when trends rose and fell, and when his own health began to fail, his relationship with the guitar remained joyful. He could still pick it up and lose himself in the simple pleasure of sound. That joy insulated him from the darker impulses that rivalry can breed. In the end, Eddie Van Halen's story is not one of grudges, but of growth. Each conflict taught him something essential. Heroes are human, peers are insecure, imitators are inevitable, and comparisons are temporary. What endures is the work. The notes you leave behind matter more than the opinions that surrounded them. When Eddie passed away in 2020, the conversations about rivalry and tension faded into the background. What remained was consensus. Even those who once dismissed him, questioned him, or stood uncomfortably beside him acknowledged the truth. He changed the instrument forever. The guitar world did not just move on from Eddie Van Halen. It continues to speak in a language he helped invent. And that ultimately is the resolution Eddie found. Not in winning arguments or being understood by everyone, but in knowing that his voice, however often echoed, could never be erased. In the end, the idea that Eddie Van Halen hated six guitarists says far more about the storytelling hook than it does about the man himself. What the full journey reveals is not a list of enemies, but a portrait of an artist navigating the emotional cost of changing an entire art form while still wanting to be accepted within it. Eddie entered the guitar world as a fan before he became a revolutionary. He loved his heroes deeply, studied them obsessively, and carried their sounds into his own experiments. When some of those heroes later failed to understand him, it hurt, not because his ego was fragile, but because his connection to music was personal. He wasn't playing to dominate. He was playing to express something honest. Rejection from that perspective cuts deeper. As his influence spread, the challenges evolved. Cold stares from peers taught him that innovation often threatens established identities. Direct imitation taught him that originality must sometimes be defended. Constant comparison taught him that once you create something new, the world will try to redistribute its ownership. Each moment forced Eddie to grow, to draw lines, and eventually to let go. What makes Eddie Van Halen's story resonate is how human it is. He felt pride, jealousy, anger, and disappointment, but he never allowed those emotions to eclipse his love for the instrument. The guitar was always bigger than the conflict. It was where he returned when words failed, when relationships disappointed, and when the noise around him became overwhelming. By the time perspective replaced intensity, Eddie understood a truth that many creators learn too late. You cannot control how your work is received, only how honestly it is made. Once a sound enters the world, it belongs to history as much as to its creator. Others will borrow it, reshape it, and sometimes misunderstand it. That is not betrayal. It is the consequence of impact. Eddie's legacy, then, is not defined by rivalry, but by resilience. He didn't stop playing because others copied him. He didn't retreat because some didn't understand him. He kept moving forward, chasing the next sound, the next feeling, the next moment of discovery. That restless curiosity is what truly set him apart. So when the noise of rivalry fades and the headlines lose their edge, what remains is simple. Eddie Van Halen didn't build his legend by fighting others. He built it by listening to the guitar, to his instincts, and to the joy that first made him pick it up. And that joy still echoes every time someone plugs in and dares to play differently.